I'm still doing some part-time research at the university, and going to conferences and things like that, but officially retired. So I have time for doing other things apart from work.
So should we go with Chris next?
Okay, I'm Chris. I'm a rocket scientist. I've worked for every major space agency on the planet. I actually work on black holes, looking at how material falls into black holes and emits X-rays. And X-rays don't make it through our atmosphere, and so that's why I have to play with rockets. Oh, it's so sad. And so I've worked most recently with the Japanese space agency. I had to spend a year in Tokyo with my new satellite that fell out of the sky the day I emigrated. There's a whole story behind that. So that's my background. And I find it one of the most surprising things. I come not from any sort of academic family or family where people go to university. My sister was the first generation of my family to go to university, and I got to work for NASA and for the Japanese Space Agency. It's been amazing. The other most surprising thing in my life that happened to me was becoming a Christian. So many people have this idea that Christianity and science don't go together. And actually, growing up in the 70s, I had that idea, and I have a lot of sympathy with that viewpoint. So if that's where you are, ask me about it.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Darren?
Thank you. So my name is Darren Evans. I'm a professor of ecology and conservation at Newcastle. I focus on biodiversity and trying to sort of understand how ecosystems function. I draw a lot of my knowledge from complexity science and computing, big data, but I also run a molecular biology laboratory where we use DNA-based approaches to try to better understand how organisms interact with each other, but also primarily driven by trying to figure out what the impacts of environmental change are on the functioning of ecosystems, very much focused on biodiversity declines, in particular the insect declines that we're sort of seeing in various parts of the world at the moment, but also trying to find solutions to that. So trying to find ways of turning things around and restoring degraded ecosystems too. So I primarily focus on farmland and forests, trying to find ways of producing food sustainably that doesn't necessarily mean the loss of wildlife and protected areas. And all of this is very much motivated by my faith, and hopefully I'll get a chance to speak about that later.
Great, we'll go with Cheryl lastly then.
Hi, I'm Cheryl. I used to be, well, I'm still a scientist. I don't think you ever stop being a scientist once you've trained as one, but I used to be a cell biologist, a molecular biologist, until I was in my 40s. And then I metamorphosed into a biblical scholar and theologian over a period of time. So I have a foot in both camps, you could say. And as I became a follower of Jesus during my first year at uni, when I was struggling with what seemed to be a conflict between what I was being told about the Bible and God and what I was being told in biology, but came through and found a way through. I'm also very willing to talk about anything like that tonight. But I've worked in various projects in the theological field, including the way that the biblical texts are used to talk about environmental crisis and how we treat creation. But at the moment, my main job is helping to train people within the Church of England. That's vicars and readers and others in lay ministry in the Church of England, and other non-Anglicans that may come along to train. So I have a passion for trying to help people engage with biblical texts.
Great, thank you very much, all of you. Well, just before we get started officially, we'll just ask a quick little fun question. So what is one thing that you are all looking forward to doing once the whole pandemic is roughly over? We can say on the 21st of June, hopefully, fingers crossed, that's when. But yeah, what's one thing you're really looking forward to doing? We'll go same order.
Well, I have 4 grown-up children and I have 3 grandchildren, and I'm just looking forward to being able to see them and hug them again.
Seeing family, yes, but I love traveling. I loved living in Japan. I'd love to go back to Japan.
Nice.
For me, it's probably going to be a decent cappuccino in a nice cafe somewhere in Newcastle. Just, yeah, interacting with people again, being able to resume my kind of interactions with people who I work with around the world, who I just haven't seen for over a year.
Funny that, because I was going to say flat white, a decent flat white with some good bunch of mates sitting in a pub or a cafe. Brilliant.
Sounds great.
Oh, thanks. I love that. Yeah, definitely. I think interacting with people is something I'm very much looking forward to. So, so today, just for everyone who's tuned in, we're going to be first listening to a short talk, and then majority of the time will be spent for you to ask your questions, and our panel will be answering them for you. So, just a quick demonstration about how you can ask your questions. So we're going to do it first by Slido. So if you log on to slido.com, as it's shown on the screen, and the code that you enter is 95708, and this should take you to our event. And during the talk or any time, please just type in your question at the top. And a great thing about Slido is that you can see everybody else's questions. They are anonymous, so your name won't be there. You can also upvote other people's questions, so that if you like their question, you want that, it'll be pushed up to the top, and then we'll more likely be answering that when we get to the Q&A. You can also type in your text your questions to the number 0775 4365926. All this information will be down below in the description, so if you do forget, it will be there. But yeah, that's it from me. I'll hand it over to Bill if you're ready and you're happy, and we'll just get started.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't say anything earlier about the relationship for me between science and faith, because that's what I'm going to cover now. I am actually a leader of a local group of this organization called Christians in Science. And it's throughout my time as a scientist, I've been concerned about that interaction. I became a Christian almost exactly at the same time as I started at university as a student. So that's always been a big question for me that's been important. So faith in science. Well, we hear a lot these days about following the science. There's no doubt that the coronavirus pandemic has generated more interest in science from people who weren't bothered much before. And we see a wide range of attitudes, from outright antagonism, including all sorts of conspiracy theories, to total acceptance and faith, with confusion and misunderstanding all the way in between. Now, faith was a deliberate choice of word there. Well, lots of people think that it doesn't go with science. Faith versus science is a false antithesis that's pushed by some kinds of Christian believers on one side, who think that science is fundamentally anti-God, and on the other side by unbelievers who adopt unhelpful false definitions of faith that pitch it against rational thought, an attitude that's been too readily taken up by secular culture as a whole. But faith is really just another word for trust, and includes the personal commitment that's based on it in normal everyday life. We all exercise faith in this sense whenever we sit down in a chair, assuming without real thought that it will support us, or when we drive across a bridge or ride the metro, or when we take medicines or eat food. Science is all about making theories and models that are as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary, to provide explanations that best fit the available evidence from experiments and observations. And as more evidence is found, scientists change and improve these models, and they sometimes need to throw them away and find new ones. So scientists have to believe their evidence or have good reason to reject it. And they trust their often imperfect and incomplete theories and models as far as they go. And that's a form of faith too, having faith in science. Now, the idea that science and religious faith, and specifically Christian faith, are in conflict is a myth invented in the 19th century, largely in two books that are now discredited by historians of science. But it lives on, fueled by endlessly recycled baseless internet stories, in entertainment, and by social and other media that promote arguments. Well, after all, conflict sells papers, harmony doesn't. Now, typical example is from a preview article in the Los Angeles Times about the 2009 film called Creation that was based on the life of Charles Darwin. And the quote is, "The eternal friction between science and religion is back on the big screen." Well, there's nothing eternal about it. Paul Bettany, who plays Darwin in the film, said in an interview that Darwin was in the process of killing off God. It's such a pity that he so misunderstood the character that he was playing. Darwin did have problems with Christianity as he got older, but they were because of personal family tragedies, not from his work on evolution. And he became an agnostic, not an atheist. And to the end of his days, he continued to support financially missionary work in South America. And opposition to Darwin's new theory came primarily at the time from other scientists whose pet theories were upset, not from the church. The same was true of the pioneering astronomers Copernicus and Galileo. Contrary to popular legend that you'll see all over the place, they were both devoted Christian believers to the end of their lives, and the stories that they were persecuted and even tortured by the church are more fiction than fact. Along with other early modern scientists who called themselves natural philosophers, because the term scientist wasn't introduced till about 1800, they did their research on the fundamental belief or faith that the universe was rational because its creator was rational. So it was capable of sensible investigation by rational beings made in his image. Thinking God's thoughts after him is an abbreviated version of how the astronomer Kepler described scientific research. It's a good way of putting it. Their approach certainly worked. And it's still true today. There are many Christian scientists, medics, and engineers, often at the forefront of their professions. Prominent examples in key areas you'll recognize include Francis Collins, former director of the Human Genome Project in the USA, who's now the director of the National Institutes of Health. And he became a Christian because of what he discovered in science. The recently deceased Sir John Houghton, former Director General of the Met Office and a leader of the Nobel Peace Prize winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, big topic, and Jennifer Wiseman working at NASA as Senior Program Scientist for the Hubble Space Telescope. And they include also many of the staff at Newcastle University, two of whom you have with you tonight. In the final analysis, whatever the likes of the Oxford New Atheist biologist Richard Dawkins may say, faith is not an explanation of reality competing with science. It's not primarily an intellectual exercise at all, and certainly not a rejection of rational thought either. But first and foremost, it's trust, a trust in and a relationship with a living and personal God made known to us, particularly in Jesus Christ. And as such, it doesn't and it can't conflict with genuine science, which is also part of God's truth, but it's complementary to it and entirely consistent with it. That's certainly what we believe. An online conference last year had the title, Telling a Better Story, Why Faith and Science Belong Together. Its stated aim was to show that there's a better story to be told about faith and science than the prevalent one of conflict and mutual distrust. And that's what we are here to do this evening as well.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to hear just a little bit from the other three panelists now as well. So we'll start with Chris, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, as I was saying at the start, growing up, being a teenager in the 70s, there was this kind of, I picked up this prevalent idea from our culture that science and faith didn't belong together. It wasn't something I thought about very hard. These were the days before the internet, and it was also the days before Richard Dawkins. So it was not so easy to find any articles about this, but I knew science was fascinating. I knew that it showed me a picture of the universe, how the universe worked, that I just found entrancingly beautiful. And so I really wanted to go and study astrophysics. And so that's what I was working towards as a teenager. I would do my homework. And I'd do it the next week and the next week, because training your brain in quite difficult ways of thinking, we have to work at it. No one gets there. There's no kind of wild genius. That's another of these tropes in the media. You see someone who just happens to be good at higher tensor analysis. It does not work like that. It's a very specialist language, and you always need to work and work and work some more. So as I was working to this, I'd kind of picked up the idea from our culture that evolution happened, hence there was no God. The Big Bang happened, hence there is no God. So I thought that the scientific ideas about the beginning of life and the beginning of the universe were different from the biblical account. So then there was no point in trusting the Bible about anything. And I was quite an evangelical atheist at that point. That changed for me when a friend of mine got baptized and invited me to her baptism. And I saw people for whom faith was a living reality, not a routine going through the motions ritual. It didn't make me become a Christian, but it shocked me enough to go and have a conversation with the pastor afterwards, to tell him, probably at great length, what a bad idea Christianity was. He stood his ground and gave me good evidence for believing in Christianity. I was shocked that there was any evidence that you could have. I was also shocked that someone could argue better than me, but that's merely a point of pride. He asked me, okay, if Christianity is such a bad idea, who was Jesus? Who do you say Jesus was? And I came out with the classic bad answer that he was a good teacher. And his response was, well, that's an interesting answer, because if he was only a good teacher, why did he allow people to worship him as God? I had never met anyone who could argue with me before. So it was a really interesting day. And the more I looked at the evidence for Christianity, the more I became convinced. As scientists, that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to look at the evidence. We're meant to weigh the evidence. Evidence isn't the same as proof, but we're meant to weigh the evidence and follow the evidence, follow what's the most likely explanation for the evidence offered.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Darren next.
Thank you. So one of the things that I do as a lecturer at Newcastle, every year I have a new cohort of students or tutees that I'm responsible for. And what I tend to do, particularly when we're sort of talking about biodiversity or, caring for the natural world, is ask students, why should we care about nature? Why should we care about biodiversity? Why should we protect rainforest, for example? And very often the sort of the responses that would come back would be, it's important that we do that because we might find some medicines, for example, or, in the context of the global pandemic, we need to take wildlife trade or illegal wildlife trade more seriously for human health. Some of them may even talk about kind of the economic benefits of looking after nature. So in the UK, we know that, pollinating insects are worth £500 million to the UK economy each year. And these are all sort of very kind of plausible reasons as to why we should care. And then I ask them, well, what motivates you? Why do you care? And that's really hard, actually, because of what doesn't get people out of bed first thing in the morning is the fact that they might find a new medicine from the rainforest, or that bumblebees might be worth something to the UK economy. I think the sort of motivating drivers for why we want to do nature conservation, for example, are very much more spiritual, very much more deep rooted. And those sorts of motives, those personal motives, can be really quite difficult, I think, for people to articulate in some way. But of course, for most people, they've chosen to do a biology degree or a zoology degree, for example, because they love nature. It may be that they love birds. It may be just that they're fascinated by plants. It may be that they do want to have some sort of medical breakthrough in some way or another. But the reality is the reason and the motives for doing these sorts of things are very rarely explored in one form or another. The beauty of studying ecology and nature conservation in particular is that our entire global effort for nature conservation is actually driven by a Judeo-Christian ethic. And this is in the textbooks. So the conservation biology textbooks I will use with my students provide the biblical basis for the primary motivation for a lot of our international treaties, for example. And this is very much driven by this idea that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So in other words, it belongs to God, it doesn't belong to us. That there's a very strong biblical ethic of stewardship and what our role, what our created role is to be in terms of God's wider creation. But that ultimately God has plans for this planet through Jesus. And we read about Jesus reconciling all things to himself in the new heaven and the new earth. And so we've got these sort of primary drivers for doing nature conservation, which are actually rooted in a biblical ethic, which very rarely tends to be spoken about or acknowledged. And I think it's really interesting that those sorts of topics are almost a taboo in our society. And what I would like to do is to try and bring these sorts of discussions more into the public square, as it were.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, Cheryl.
Thank you. Yeah, going back to Bill's talk and mention of the false idea that faith and science are in conflict, obviously that's a point of view which some people from the atheistic camp would take issue with, but also some believers. There are people who are believers who think that science and faith are in conflict. And I think that both of them agree, if you like, in this issue, because they share a particular view of the Christian scriptures. And the Christian scriptures are, and when I say the Christian scriptures, obviously the Old Testament, we call the Old Testament the Jewish Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. The tradition is that God has inspired the writings that we've got collected together in our Bible. And in one of the books in the Bible, it actually says that the writings are inspired by God and are useful for teaching and rebuking and correcting and training in righteousness. It doesn't say, and they are absolutely true in every respect of geography, history, science, and you should use nothing else. You know, there is no claim made within the Christian scriptures for the sort of role that some people want to put onto them. People who come and say, with a very modernistic worldview, well, something has got to be true or false. It's got to be truth or fiction, fact or fiction. And so if the Bible isn't absolutely true in every aspect, some believers would say, if it isn't absolutely true in every aspect, we can't trust it. And non-believers would say, it isn't true in every aspect, so it's a load of rubbish, so we can chuck it away. And they're both laboring under the misapprehension that this is a modern textbook, and it isn't. It's a library of poetry and biography and historical narrative and letters and love songs. And they're not sets of dogmas that you have to subscribe to. They're not meant to all be taken literally. There are hundreds of metaphors and word pictures in there. And I think a lot of the apparent disputes stem from that misapprehension of what the Christian scriptures claim to be in themselves. And that's one of the things I like to unpack, because I think that's at the root of some of the subjects that come up. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. So before we start our Q&A, I just want to remind everyone who's watching how you can ask your questions. So again, all the information is down below in the description, but if you go to slido.com and put the code 95708, as shown on the screen, and then just keep asking your questions on there. We've got some great questions coming through, so thank you for that. And also you can also text in your questions to the number, which is again in the bottom of your screen in the YouTube description. So I'll hand it over now to Alice to ask the first question.
Great, thank you. So we've got a little preview there of all the questions. So the first one we've got is, do you think accidents in science, such as the discovery of penicillin, are coincidences or part of God's plan?
Well, why can't the answer be both? Well, it depends what you. The thing is, we're looking at it from our human viewpoint. We see what we see. We can't see it from God's viewpoint. And if somebody discovers something, well, there's some sort of inspiration in there. We don't know what that is, but we are told, and I defer to Cheryl here, the Bible tells us that we are made in God's image. And that has a lot of different meanings, but one of the meanings is that we are capable of thinking in a rational way of certain things, but we're also capable of receiving inspiration without necessarily knowing that we've got it or how we've got it. So I think the answer is both.
I know somebody in the science faith debate years ago made a kind of distinction between I think they called them class 1 miracles and class 2 miracles. And basically the class 2 miracles are those things which aren't actually impossible. They're just very rare. And so we might call them a coincidence, or we might call them a miracle, depending on our perspective. And so perhaps, as Bill says, it's a matter of perspective as to whether God's inspired it or they just happen to have a lucky day. It's one of those things that it depends on where you are as to how you see it.
But I think as well, there's something about being made in the image of God, that we are creative. And when we're on the edge of science, when we're in this kind of research, we're not really sure quite how to think about something new. Actually, something about the imagination process and creativity, you can either see those as just part of being human, or you can see them as part of being human made in the image of God.
Thank you. So our next question, if we believe that Jesus will once again return and make all things new, is there any point to try and stop climate change?
Yes.
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 I'll go to you, Darren.
Go on, Darren, unpack it a bit.
I think it's this idea that somehow in the new heaven and a new earth. So let's be clear, there's lots of different ways of interpreting what the Bible describes as a new heaven and a new earth, and it's a branch called eschatology. And I think what people believe does matter in that sense. This idea that somehow if God is going to come and clear everything up in the future, that somehow we can just sit back and trash the planet, then we completely misunderstand scripture and the whole purpose of Christ, frankly. And I think that one of the sort of joys, but also mysteries of being a Christian, is that God's plan for a new heaven and new earth involves us, and it involves us in those redemptive processes as well. So although, you know, we may be responsible for a lot of the problems, we're also critically engaged in the solutions to that as well. And of course, what scripture does is shine a light very brightly on what's wrong with humanity, and what we need to do in order to put things right. And that's obviously being empowered by Jesus to do that. So one of the things that I really enjoy in my discipline actually is that, you know, doing nature conservation is a central part of Christian mission. It's what we are being called to do. And in so doing that, in cooperating with God in those redemptive purposes, we actually learn more of the character of God, which is what we ultimately want to know. So we want to have more meaning in our lives. But we're also involved in God's redemptive plans, and that's just really quite extraordinary, actually. So what we do and what we believe is really important, and it's never been more critical in the context of climate change and global biodiversity loss.
If I can just underline that and add one point, which I think just summarizes a lot of what Darren said. If you read what the Bible says about what we look forward to in a new creation, and you read it all and don't just focus on one or two texts that you can take as an extreme one way or the other, then there is both continuity and discontinuity involved in it. There is new, but there is renewed as well.
Yeah, and in the same way as I am going to get a resurrection body one day, the scriptures tell me, but that doesn't mean I can trash this one. So why on earth would I trash this beautiful environment in which God's placed me just because I know that God's going to bring about a restoration and renewal, and how I know that we cannot save the planet. We can't bring about the new heaven and the new earth that the Bible speaks of. that's Jesus. But we work with Jesus because we are in Christ. We are part of God's work. We are caught up in that story, that God's big rescue plan for the whole of creation that Darren spoke about earlier in Colossians. We're part of that. We're caught up in that. So yeah, trashing the planet is absolutely the last thing we should do.
Great, thank you very much. So the next question is a bit more broad. So it's, has science ever led you to question your faith?
No. Things in my life that have happened have led me to question my faith. Bill was talking earlier about Charles Darwin and actually how it was family tragedy that was the issue for him. And I think for me, it's the same. It's suffering, it's death, and that to me has been both led me to question my faith, but also strengthened my faith in some way, that when we take our questions to Jesus and actually engage with him, and or have a shouting match with him, something about engaging with Jesus brings change in us. I noticed there was a question down on the list about what if life was discovered on other planets? So that's something I'm sometimes asked. You know, would that make you question your faith if there was life elsewhere? I'm thinking, well, no, because life on this planet, how diverse and beautiful. How many different types of beetle are there? There's at least 1,000, I think. Come on, the biologists, help me out here. And if God can want more than 1,000 species of beetle, I'm sure he might want more than one species of self-aware, self-conscious people he can have a relationship with. And besides, I grew up in the 70s, and the thing on TV that really caught my attention was Star Trek, and I wanted to be Spock. So I would love there to be a planet Vulcan with Spock. I'd love to know what they think about themselves, their place in the universe, what they think about God, what they do for sex. I mean, this is what I'd love to know. That would just be fabulous.
I would say as well that yes, some science does cause me to question my faith, but also the other way round as well. So, science and scientific discoveries often challenge the way I understand the Bible, for example, and scripture. But, as Cheryl alluded to, earlier as well, that, there is, a branch called hermeneutics, which is all about kind of the interpretation of Bible texts as well. So I think on the one hand, I can be challenged in terms of my own understanding and interpretation of the Bible on the one hand. And likewise, my understanding of the Bible might challenge some of the current paradigms within science as well. But one of the things that I've learned over the years of being a scientist is that it's okay not to have black and white answers, and you're constantly living in different shades of grey, actually. And that can be quite fearful for lots of people, but it can also be really exciting as well, because there's lots of discoveries to be made. And of course, I'm an academic, and I would just encourage people to continue to study and to learn. And if nothing else, I just feel like a really old, student, frankly, because the more I study, the more I realize I know so little. Does it cause me to question my faith? Sometimes, yes. And sometimes I have doubts. but I've also learned in my faith and my understanding of God that that's okay, because of He's got me in His hand. Nothing can pluck me from that, and that's a really kind of safe place to be, actually.
I'd also just say that sometimes it's right that my faith should be challenged, because my faith is imperfect. Some things that I believe are probably not right. Certainly we're not going to claim that all our beliefs are absolutely perfect and right. We grow and we learn, just as children grow and learn in other ways. But the same is true of science. There's good science and there's bad science. And I think sometimes we have to ask whether our faith makes us question our science, and it jolly well should do sometimes.
Great, thank you. The next question is, if unfalsifiable science theory divides expert opinion, it's just a theory. Christianity has no global consensus, so why should we treat it differently to science? I'll repeat that one because that was quite long. If unfalsifiable science theory divides expert opinion, it's just a theory. Christianity has no global consensus, so why should we treat it differently to science?
Can I have a go at that? Okay, so I think I'd talk about something. An unfalsifiable science theory is something like multiple universes. So this universe is an amazing place. It's incredible, and one of the things that is so clearly strange about it is the way the physical world has allowed long-lived stars, that has allowed planets, that has allowed life to develop, that has allowed this kind of self-conscious, somewhat intelligent life sometimes to develop, and that is simply a fact, and it's quite a challenging fact, because why should the universe be set up that way? And so one way out of it is to say, okay, statistics, maybe there's billions and billions of universes, and the kind of these physical constants just kind of take on random values, and we of course can only live in the one where they take the values that allow life to develop. So that's an unfalsifiable scientific theory, that there is a multitude of universes. And it's there because looking at the Big Bang, looking at this universe, it's a bit scary if you're an atheist. So that's an unfalsifiable science theory, and it does not have consensus because it's unfalsifiable. And it is just a theory. Christianity, in some sense, isn't treated any differently from that, in the same way that some people believe very strongly in a multiverse as the only way out of this fine-tuned universe we live in, without invoking a God, which is outside of the realm of science to do. Then it is, in some sense, it's a meta theory. It's a theory of why there is something rather than nothing. Actually, I'm up for both. I strongly believe there is a God who made this entire universe, but he could well have made billions of others. What's your problem? God is bigger.
I'm not sure where the question is coming from in terms of if we're saying Christianity is a theory for how things came to be, then I can see, that's great. The way Chris has explained it is brilliant. But Christianity is a whole meta narrative, a whole way of viewing the world in a sense. And I know meta narratives are not popular in a postmodern world, but it is a way of thinking about the world. And in one sense, I can't prove that there is a God any more than anyone else can disprove that there's a God, because God, the God of the Christian scriptures, is outside creation, even though God is present with us in creation. God is different from creation. And so God doesn't kind of come into the kind of playing field of science, if you like. So I'm not quite sure that I can kind of directly answer that, but I would say, yeah, Christianity is a meta narrative, if you like, and I would say you can't prove or disprove it. I don't know, what do the others think, Bill?
Well, can I put a different angle on it? There's a popular public perception from people who aren't scientists that science is all about concrete facts and proofs, and we know it all, and that's it. And of course, that's not true. Only a certain proportion of what science studies is directly observable by our senses. A lot of it is not. We only observe it indirectly through its effects. That's true of nearly all of our subjects. And so science isn't all just about marshalling facts and knowing what's happening. It's about making models. Models are all about trying to describe things that are outside our direct experience in terms of things that we do know about. So we make models. We make, you know, when people say, what's an electron? Is it a particle? Is it a wave? Well, they're both models. They're both of them correct to some extent, and they're both of them incorrect. And scientists believe both of them, though they seem to be incompatible. You know, scientists are very good at believing things that don't agree with each other, because that's the nature of it. We recognize our models are incomplete, they're imperfect, and we need more than one to explain truth that's beyond our experience. Now, what I've just said would be exactly the same if I substituted theologians for scientists, because it's all about making models for what's beyond our direct experience. When the Bible talks about God as a father, or a rock, or an eagle, or all sorts of other things, they're not literal. They're models, which goes back to something Cheryl was saying earlier about literal understandings. So it's all about making models of what's beyond our direct experience to try and make sense of things. And I think science and theology have a lot more in common than most people realize.
Okay, thank you. So another popular question is it possible for the Bible to be true if the universe is billions of years old? If not, what evidence is there that it is only a few thousand years old? If you'd like me to repeat it, I can.
No, we understand the question. It's a common one. The Bible doesn't say that doesn't contradict the view that the universe is 14.5 billion years old. Nowhere. It's it goes back to Cheryl's point about you can read the Bible in a certain way that you can interpret it as saying that, you know, the whole universe was created on the 4th of August or the 10th of October, sorry, or whatever it was, 4004 BC, a number that's often trotted out. It's not there. The language of creation isn't a scientific account. It's not a historical account, it's a poetic account. The Bible tells us that God created. It doesn't give us the mechanism by which he did it. There's no conflict.
So wasn't it Copernicus or Kepler, one of them, who said the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go?
It's Galileo, actually.
No, it was one of the cardinals that Galileo was quoting, actually. I think it was Belisarius that said it. Yeah, absolutely.
But Galileo is the person who's often cited as saying it.
I noticed there was a question also on the screen about evolution. So can I say a little bit about something? Is it all right, guys, if I
it's related, isn't it?
Put the two together, yeah. When we look at that first Genesis account, and there's two creation accounts at the beginning of Genesis, we've got the famous 7 days. And in the same way as it was written in Hebrew, because that was the language the person who wrote it knew, the person who wrote it is using the language and the metaphors and the pictures that made sense to their contemporaries. And in, I'm trying to use the non-Eurocentric way of talking about the Middle East, in ancient Southwest Asia, several of the cultures around there had creation accounts where they understood there were gods who made humans, who made the earth, and several of them had soil, earth, being shaped to form humans. Several of them had 7 days, because 7 was the perfect number, because 7 was the number of heavenly bodies other than the stars, the sun, moon, and the visible planets. So 7 was heavenly, so it was a perfect number, spoke of perfection. And they all understood the world around them as being quite chaotic and wild and dangerous, because they were only just kind of settling and agriculture was getting going. And so they saw God or gods as imposing some order, separating, making spaces and populating them. And that's the language of Genesis. So you start off with a chaos. And unlike some of the other countries around there, there's only one God in the Hebrew account, not a whole set of them. One of the other stories of around the same time has a whole bunch of gods. A couple of them end up fighting. The dead body of the god that gets killed gets broken up to form the earth. Humans get made as an afterthought to be slaves of the gods, to prepare sacrifices to feed them, because the gods were too lazy to do their own work. That's the kind of idea of humanity and how they thought of their deities. The Hebrew writers going, no, 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 completely different. God is one, and God just has to speak and things come to be, and God imposes order on the chaos and makes these spaces of light and dark and sky and water and land and sea, and then populates them with things. And so it's speaking of one creator who brings order, who designs creation specifically, has that sort of desire to have creation rather than it being an accidental dismembered God. And humanity aren't the slaves. Humanity are made as part of this creation to have a specific role. Humanity part of the same soil, and yet somehow distinct, because they are made, and men and women, not just the guys, men and women are made in the image of God. So it's a story which can speak those truths to you and I, and could speak the same truths to the people several thousand years ago. It's a timeless story. And so it isn't in conflict with the Big Bang, it isn't in conflict with an old Earth, it isn't in conflict with evolution, because it's not speaking to that. It's telling us the really important stuff about life, which is about God, ourselves, and our relationship with God and with the rest of the creation.
Can I respond to that as well from the science perspective too, in that there is this sort of false dichotomy between kind of 6-day creation and evolution, which tends to sort of pop its head up from time to time. And, you know, again, if we just sort of go to some of the giants in the field of evolutionary biology. So, you know, in the textbooks for our stage 1 students at Newcastle, you know, we quote Dobzhansky, who says that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And it's this really sort of seminal piece of work from the 1970s. And interestingly, it's all to do with questions of faith, actually, even though it's fundamentally important in terms of our understanding of evolution as well. And one of the sort of things that he concludes, you can sort of look it up on Wikipedia and so on, at the end of the essay, is that he says, and I'll quote, "It's a blunder to mistake the Holy Scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology." And so the point that I'm trying to make here is actually that people of faith are also people who are leaders in the field and in so many disciplines, and who would just be appalled to be told that in some way they're being blasphemous for, you know, making these hugely significant scientific discoveries in one form or another. And that's why I think it goes back to what Bill said at the very beginning. It's sort of a myth. And yeah, whether it is the media or where this comes from, I'm not so sure. But actually, I work with so many eminent scientists who are very open about their Christian faith.
Yeah, and it's not just that they're being blasphemous then, Darren, it's they're being accused of being schizophrenic, which we're not. We hold them together.
Great, thank you all. A slight follow-up from the evolution question. Doesn't Darwinism suggest that if our physical nature evolves, then so will our morality? Is this a problem for religion?
It doesn't imply that at all. Darwin's theory is all about biological processes. It doesn't necessarily suggest moral, ethical, or any other such development like that. That was an idea that was bolted on later by social scientists. And one of the people whose names come to my mind there is Herbert Spencer. And he was the one who actually devised the term and introduced the term survival of the fittest. It wasn't Darwin. So this whole idea of some sort of moral development and so on, and that we get better, and the primitive people of the Old Testament were backwards morally, that's just not part of biological evolution. That's confusing social science and core science. Darren might want to comment. It's more his field than mine.
Not really, other than the fact that you sort of hear Darwinism used in a whole range of inappropriate contexts, as you've just said, Bill.
Yeah, social Darwinism. Yeah.
Yeah, I would much rather we just sort of focus on the works of Darwin, actually, and the discoveries that Darwin made. Again, all sorts of amazing biological discoveries without even knowing what was underlying that, in terms of, didn't know what DNA was, for example, gene expression and so on. So yeah, for me, I think Darwin is hugely important and influential in biology, and that's where I think I'd like to keep him.
Thank you. So our next question is, have you ever faced any opposition for your faith? If so, how do you deal with it?
I'm not sure I've ever experienced it within the realm of science. In other parts of life, yes, but that's not really the point here. But within science, I don't think that I consciously have. You just get people saying, how can you possibly be a Christian and a scientist? But they're not people who are scientists asking that usually. They're school children.
Or family members.
Or family members.
In my case, how can you possibly believe that fairy tale if you're a scientist? So yeah, I mean,
that's a question. So it's an opportunity to answer.
In fact, and that's one reason, you know, when I said earlier about that misapprehension of scripture, it's but your Bible says, you know, telling me what my Bible says, to say that it's against science, you know, it's the same kind of basic misconception. Occasionally, I think, queries from colleagues once or twice, but not so much hostile, just puzzlement, I think, because again, they've got an idea of what religious faith of any kind is, and it isn't compatible with their idea of science. So
I think I'd concur with Cheryl in that I think people bring all sorts of preconceptions as to what a Christian is. So by sort of announcing that you're a Christian amongst biologists, there may be one or two that will automatically assume that you're anti-evolution, for example. because of that's what right-wing evangelicals think, right? You know, so, you know, it is there. And I think that in my experience, particularly sort of students, early career researchers tend not to stick their head above the parapet in case there are some sort of consequences of doing so, which then begs the question, how have we got into this situation where beliefs are now off limits within, you know, our public discourse? I think, you know, within the university, you know, it's kind of a hot political potato at the moment in terms of free speech and sort of people being blanked and so on going forward, which, you know, incidentally isn't a problem within universities in my experience. But nevertheless, I think we should sort of ask the questions, why is it that people's beliefs are taboo? Because of when it comes to the conservation crisis, for example, that I'm involved with, actually people's beliefs are really important because of their beliefs will drive their behavior and their sort of view of the world around us. So I think what I would like us to do, you know, I think we can be grown up and mature enough to be able to bring our beliefs and values into this sort of this public square, if you like, to discuss. But one of the things that we've done really badly, I think, in recent years is learn how to kind of disagree well. And it's almost as though if you say something which somebody disagrees with, you must be bad, or you must be the enemy, or worse, you must be thick. And, you know, we've seen that, whether it's through, you know, the debates around Brexit, for example, or whether, you know, we see in the US elections and so on. Why is it that we've got to that point where we can't disagree well with people on matters that we disagree with? And so why is it that, you know, perhaps talking about Christianity is sort of off limits in certain circumstances as well? You know, surely we've got the faculties and the maturity among us to be able to discuss about these things which are kind of really central to human life in a manner which is courteous and respectful. So, you know, for me, I would very much like us to be able to move in that way so that people can talk more openly and more freely. And of course, you know, university is the place where we do this, right? And if we ever get to a point where we can't do this, then we're in serious trouble. So, so let's try and keep the dialogue open and respectful.
Can just pop one other point into this just quickly. It's the sort of the other side of the question, in a sense. This is about facing opposition because of your Christian faith. I would like to think that as a Christian, it has some impact on my character in terms of positive qualities of things like reliability and honesty and things like this, and being hardworking and so on. I'm not saying that that's restricted to Christians by any means, but I think there's a correlation there. And I think that over the years, I've had plenty of colleagues who've realized and reckoned that they can trust me in various ways, and that deep down it's got something to do with my Christian faith. So I think it's welcomed as well as maybe sometimes regarded as odd.
I think just one other point I might add, in that I'm a real kind of fighter for students, is that, you know, I have come across students who are Christians, who have been told by various people that they can't be a Christian and believe in evolution. In situations like that, I kind of say, get those people to show you the biblical basis for that, because of course they can't. And this whole idea somehow that you need to conform to some sort of dogma, is ludicrous, and it's a complete misrepresentation of the Bible and of Scripture. It's all about Jesus ultimately, and that's where our focus should be. And we can have some disagreements over other parts of Scripture that we might, have some sort of differing opinions over. So I think it's, we just have to be aware as well that, even within the wider church, that there are some colourful characters on the fringes that can make life difficult for people who do have faith.
I've had some run-ins with them, so I'll amen to that, Darren.
Yeah. I think we all have.
Yes, I think I've had more opposition from well-meaning, but I think quite misguided Christians than I have from scientists or in my work context. And yeah, I had a guy storm out of one of my public talks saying, "You can't possibly be a Christian because you," and it was I had probably not dealt with his question quite wisely, but I was still a bit mortified, actually.
It's been going on. It's been going on since the early church, because within the pages of the New Testament, you find this argument about whether men should be circumcised if they're Christ followers.
Yeah.
Whether you have to be circumcised to be a Christ follower.
Yeah.
And so the attempt to tack something else onto faith in Jesus as a requirement for being a believer is nothing new. It's been going on for centuries.
Well, biblically, the only test of Christianity is saying Jesus is Lord. Biblically, that's it. It is not your stance or my stance on evolution or how we interpret anything. It's do we say Jesus is Lord? Tick. That's biblically the only place to go.
Great, thank you. Next question. Should humans always try to save or elongate life?
Oh, good question.
As an end in itself, I would have to ask why. What is the reason for it? That the desire to do so is ultimately grounded in the thought that this life is it, and that's all there is. And a Christian doesn't believe that. A Christian believes that this life is only part of what there is, and that there's further life to come. So extending life just for its own sake, I would want to question what the motives are. And I think the motives are based on an understanding that's not Christian.
But at the same time, there's been a long tradition within the Judeo-Christian tradition of medicine, of healing, of caring for the sick, and defending people against premature death. And that, that you can trace back for hundreds of years. So it's, I think that's why I said it's a good question, because there's that sense in which, no, you're right, it's not always right to prolong life, and some, but where the judgment is as to when is right and when isn't, I think is a difficult one. But you have got that in that sort of literal sense, pro-life kind of approach to healthcare throughout as the backdrop to that.
I mean, this is sort of probably not answering the question in the spirit in which it was asked, but anybody involved in environmental issues will sort of really understand the sort of global inequalities in terms of the standard and quality of life that people have, and it's always the poor that suffer first. So it's the poor who will suffer first the consequences of climate change, and we're seeing that already. And it will be the poor who are living in the most sort of environmentally degraded parts of the planet as well. They will suffer. The Bible speaks very strongly about that, and in particular our care for the poorest people in the world, because that's really essential to God's heart, and which is why so many people live sacrificially in going to serve in parts of the planet where the need is greatest. So, should we prolong life in parts of the world where life expectancy is lower? Yes, we should. And we should very much put our focus and resources there. Should we deal with issues that lead to lower life expectancy, such as malnutrition, poor access to water, education, energy, shelter, all those things? Yes, absolutely, we should. And there's lots, particularly in the Old Testament and the ethics, to really put the safeguards in to protect the inequalities, to stop people getting super rich and to stop people getting super poor as well. And I think looking at the state of the world now, there's a lot of wisdom that we can glean from Scripture to help us address some of these global issues.
But I think also as well, going back to the original question, something about quality of life as well. My dad had cancer and was dying. I don't think interventions to prolong his life would have been useful or even kind.
Thank you. And I think we're going to have, this is our final question for tonight. Has your faith ever caused you to disagree with a scientific theory?
I can't think of a case where my faith would cause me to disagree with scientific theory, though I think it would frequently happen that I would disagree with some interpretation and application. But that's not pure science in itself. That's science going off the deep end and getting it wrong or being applied wrongly. There are all sorts of things that I would question the attitude that you sometimes see, which says if we can do something, we should do it. Because we're capable, we should do it. That's progress. And I think that leaves out moral and ethical questions about what's right and wrong. And that's where I think that my faith would want to question the use and application to which some science is put in ethical and moral terms.
And if it's a theory, if the question is talking about a scientific theory, yeah, you might question it on other grounds. You might think, well, it doesn't seem very likely, or, there's a competing theory that you think has more evidence. So there might be reasons for doubting it on scientific grounds, but I can't think of anything that's ever clashed with. I can't even, struggling to even think of something that could.
Yes.
Because science is kind of dealing with the physical, whether it's tiny or billions of light years away, that's that. And I can't think of anything that science would come up with about the realm of science that would clash with my faith. Can you, Chris?
I am looking blank.
Yeah.
This is the sort of question that you sort of might wake up in the middle of the night with an answer to, where you sort of kick yourself and wish you had something, that you could just say in a Zoom call like this. But I could think of an example the other way round in terms of how my understanding of Scripture affects my understanding of science. So, you know, one of the things that I've learned very much in the Bible is Jesus being incarnational, and very much the emphasis on relationships, and you know, the fact that actually all things are connected. You know, everything's connected. We read that you know, Christ is also the sustainer of the universe, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it, particularly when you start thinking, well, what happened when he was crucified? Who was holding it all together then, sort of thing, which is fine. You know, it's okay to think about those. But what I've kind of really, what's really motivated me in my current research is that, you know, I'm a network ecologist. So I'm really interested in how things interact directly and indirectly across space and time. And so, you know, we use all of the advances that that computer science has brought us, understanding the relationships of Facebook, Google algorithms, using the computer processing power that we've now got to kind of look at the functioning of ecosystems. And just to say, you know, we still don't know now as scientists what makes an ecosystem stable. Nobody knows this. You know, there's still a huge amount of work and discovery to be done. But for me, it's very much kind of thinking about the interconnectedness of all things and God's hand in all of that. And that's a really kind of exciting place to be, because it just makes my reading of scripture and my understanding of God much more exciting and interesting.
Yeah, you're right, Darren. The current knowledge in biology enriches your understanding of some of the biblical passages, doesn't it? It really fleshes it out. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you to all our panel, and thank you as well to everyone watching for your amazing questions. I definitely know I learned so much from just listening to all the answers, so thank you so much. Before you all leave, I'd just really love to let you know more about all the societies and organisations that have been able to put this event for you. So first of all, Newcastle CU Christian Union. If you'd like to know more about what they do and about other events that we've got going on, please do check out our Facebook page, Newcastle Christian Union. And also on Instagram, we're also there on Instagram, so please do check out those. And Alice will talk us a bit later about the events that we've got going on. As well, Newcastle CMF, they've also got a Facebook page and an Instagram page, so please do check those out as well if you'd like to know more about what we're doing there. And yeah, if I'd like to hand over to Bill and Cheryl if you'd like to talk about Christians in Science and what you're doing with them.
Yep, sure. From the Christians in Science viewpoint, I'd just like to say this is the first joint venture we've had with the CU, and I certainly hope it's not going to be anything like the last. I think there's a really positive interaction we can have, because one thing we want to do, as well as demonstrate this compatibility of Christian faith and science, is to support Christian students who are doing science, who do have some struggles and questions and issues, and we've got resources to help them with that. And you'll find those in Christians in Science as an organisation, which I'm a local group leader. If you want to know more about what we do, there is a website that I look after, which doesn't have Christians in Science in the title for historical reasons I won't go into, but it's interesting in conjunction with tonight's event that its name is Big Questions Any Answers.org, and I think that's visible in the streaming. And if you go in there, it's got lots of events that are available. It does include a student-focused and early careers focused conference that the Central National Christians in Science is running, which happens to be this weekend. So if you're interested and want to find out, you better get down and have a look at it quickly. But Cheryl's one of the speakers at that, so I'll let her say a word or two.
Thanks, Bill. Yes, it's Friday evening and Saturday through to about 3 o'clock, I think, this coming weekend. We've got several speakers, the focus being on controversies that come up within a kind of scientific and faith background, but more generally of interest too. So controversies within the church, not just sort of between the church and outside. So there's one session thinking about controversies and how we handle them. Then there's going to be a session on gender and sexuality. I'm doing a session on abortion and IVF. And then the third session is on mental health. So if you're interested in that, I think there's a small fee to cover some materials they mail out to you. But do check the website out if you're interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so just some final notices and some events we've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. So as a Christian Union, we have each year an events week, which we put on a number of events. So this year it's an events fortnight because it's all on Zoom, and a lot of Zoom in 1 week is a bit too much. But yeah, we've got lots of events going on over those 2 weeks. The whole timetable is up on the Facebook page. So if you want to find out more about specifics of those and Zoom links, etc., just head over there and have a look at all of that. Yeah, we'd love to see as many of you along as possible. We've also got an event on at the moment weekly called Glad You Asked, which is a discussion group where we're able to ask questions and attempt at answering them and looking at a different topic each week. So if you've got any specific questions or just want to hear more and hear about different questions, feel free to come along to that. Feel free to message the CU Facebook page to find out more about that. I think there should also be a link on there to join the Facebook page as well. So if that is something that would interest you, please feel free to come along to that. I'll be there. So yeah, there'll be one face that you know if you do come along to that. Yeah, I think that is officially it. We're sorry if we didn't get around to your questions tonight. There was a lot, so thank you so much for that. But like I say, if you come along to any of the other events, feel free to ask those questions, and also feel free just to message the page and ask questions as well if you would like to do that. And we'll try and get someone to either give you a call or just try and message you the best answer we can give you. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining tonight. A big thank you again to our panelists for being so keen to answer questions and for all the answers you've given us. It's been really great personally to hear from you all as well, and I'm sure everybody else has enjoyed it too. So thank you all and have a great evening.